Suburban Sentinel here. Bella the camera cat is on assignment, sleeping in a window downstairs. This is the fourth installment of our series on detachable box magazines. Today we're focusing on magazine maintenance. And yes, magazines do require periodic maintenance, overhaul, and or replacement. Why? Because contaminants can interfere with the proper operation of the magazine, and corrosion weakens magazine springs, both of which can lead to magazine failures. So first up, let's discuss the issue of magazine cleaning. And the basic question is, how often should one clean a magazine? First, I believe it is a very good practice to clean magazines as soon as practicable after exposure to the elements. And what do I mean by exposure to the elements? If you've had your gun and the associated magazines out in the rain or snow, if the magazine has been dropped in the dirt or exposed to severe dust conditions out in the desert or something to that effect. So again, any significant exposure to the elements, just take them down and clean them. It's usually not that big of a deal. Even if your magazines do not get exposed to harsh elements, for example, if you use your firearm in an indoor range and the magazine sits on a bench, the magazines still require periodic cleaning. Carbon, powder residue, gun oils tend to build up in the magazines over time. So let's review some popular magazine cleaning schedule options. First is some folks clean their magazines after every range session, regardless of whether the magazine was exposed to the elements or not. And I follow this particular option. I'm not saying that's the right way, but it is one option. Is it overkill? Yeah, I think it is. However, I do have a rational basis for cleaning after every session. First, the anti-corrosive compound I use on steel magazines and all magazine springs doesn't last that long. In addition, all of my firearms are defensive guns, and I want my guns to be running 100% all the time. Finally, breaking down the magazines and cleaning them isn't that much effort. So again, although cleaning after every range session is probably overkill, to me the burden of it is just not that great. I'm not saying this is the way to do it. This choice may not work for everybody, and that's certainly understandable. Another popular option for magazine cleaning is by round count. This tends to be good for high volume shooters. Some folks clean their magazines whenever they do a detail strip down and thorough cleaning of their firearm, typically every 1,000, 1,200 rounds or so. And I do believe that this is a very good option as well. Also, you can begin your periodic magazine maintenance at lower round counts, and based on the condition of your magazines when you do the cleaning, you can increase your round count or reduce the round count as you feel appropriate. Again, I think this option is very good for high volume shooters. Not so much if you're a low volume shooter. If you take your firearm out once every year and fire 50 rounds through it, I would go another route. Specifically, low volume shooters are probably best served by cleaning magazines based on the amount of time that's passed. Certainly one can clean their magazines monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, etc. However, I wouldn't recommend going more than 6 months between cleaning magazines. So to me, semi-annual would be about the maximum. Now this assumes that the magazines in question are what I call active magazines, meaning that they're kept loaded, they're used periodically, not magazines that are stored in a controlled environment for later use and not touched. Again, this is a good method for occasional shooters, and an advantage is one can increase or decrease the interval between cleanings as you find appropriate. So let's briefly examine the factors that may influence your choice of cleaning schedule. First, is the firearm a defensive armament or is it a range toy? Obviously, if it's just a plinker, reliability of the gun and associated accessories is not a big factor. Second, the type of firearm. Some guns just tend to run dirtier than others. Third is the type of ammunition. Some of the milsurp ammos just tend to run dirty. Fourth is whether you use a preservative on your magazines. Magazines that are properly treated with anti-corrosive and or lubricants tend to have less buildup of carbon fouling, etc. I'm going to do a video on actual magazine cleaning. This series has gone on much longer than I expected due to the after effects of Hurricane Sandy and our associated cleanup efforts. So let's move on to overhaul and replacement. As we discussed in part 3 of this series, these box-fed magazines do not last forever. Even a well-designed and well-made magazine still only has a limited number of cycles in its useful life of the magazine spring. And again, a cycle is one complete compression of the spring and full release of that compression. The problem is that the firearms and magazine manufacturers do not publish the number of cycles in the expected life of the magazine springs. Most of the manufacturers say change on condition. But for me, that strategy is too risky because my firearms are all defensive in nature and I want them running 100% all the time. So let's examine some alternatives for magazine overhaul and repair. One viable alternative to change on condition is to either change your magazine spring or toss the magazine after a certain number of cycles. And although the manufacturers don't publish the cycle limit on their magazines, I believe that a well-designed and well-built magazine spring should last 250 complete cycles. How did I arrive at that number? Certainly it's nothing scientific. It's based on my experience in designing and maintaining components that use springs extensively in the aerospace industry. Also, I believe that 250 cycles is an ultra-conservative number. I think most magazines, or most decent magazines, will last much longer. But again, my defensive firearms, I want to be ultra-conservative. I'd rather spend a bit more money either overhauling or replacing my magazines than having them become unreliable or fail when the chips are down. So that's where the 250 comes from. And again, the next logical question is, knowing the number of cycles between rebuilds or replacements is fine, but how do we convert that number into something useful for most shooters? Many shooters keep track of the number of rounds fired from each of their handguns, and that's a very good idea for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is for maintenance of the firearm and its associated accessories. So we know we want to either overhaul or replace our magazines at 250 cycles, which again, that's an ultra-conservative number. If you feel it's excessively conservative, that's fine. That's just what works for me. Here's how you convert cycles to round counts. First, you take your, I'm going to use my tactical letter opener here. First, you take your magazine capacity and you multiply that by the number of active magazines. Again, active magazines are those that you have in use rather than long-term storage. And again, multiply that by the number of cycles desired before replacement of the spring or replacement of the entire magazine. By way of example, assume that a firearm has a magazine capacity of 10 rounds. Let's also assume that this firearm has 3 magazines in use, or 3 active magazines. And that's certainly a reasonable number for a handgun. You may keep 1 in the pistol itself and then 2 additional magazines on your belt. And also, let's assume that you want to replace the magazine spring or replace the magazine after 250 cycles. So it's a relatively simple calculation. Just multiply 10 rounds times the 3 magazines in use times 250 cycles, and that yields 7,500 rounds between magazine spring replacements. Of course, this formula assumes that you're going to be using each of the active magazines the same amount of times, or at least roughly the same number of times. It also assumes that each magazine is of the same capacity. Certainly, it's not uncommon to use different round capacity magazines. For example, one of my firearms, I keep a 10 round magazine in the gun and then 2 15 round magazines on my belt. And it's relatively easy to adjust the formula for the different capacities. If you're mathematically challenged, feel free to send me a private message and I'll help you with the formula. I know everybody's not a math whiz. What's the old saying? 80% of Americans don't understand fractions and the other half don't care. So now let's move on to a couple of other options for magazine spring changeouts. Another viable method is just to either toss or rebuild your magazines after a given time period, say 5 or 6 or 2 or 10 years. Whatever that time period may be depends on the factors we discussed previously. If you know your approximate round count on a firearm every year and have a limited number of active magazines, one can make a fairly accurate guess as to when you'll hit your desired life cycle limit on the springs. Another less popular but certainly viable option is just to change your magazine springs when your firearm is due for other more significant maintenance. For example, assume that you have a handgun, specifically a pistol, in which you elect to change the mainspring every 6,000 rounds. One can just change the magazine springs contemporaneously with that mainspring. That's the method I prefer, not because it's better than any of the other methods we discussed. It's just one less thing for me to keep track of. It may cost more, a little more anyway, but time is money and complexity is time, so to me it's worth it. One last comment on overhaul and repair. Don't automatically assume that it's more cost effective to replace the magazine spring than replace the entire magazine. Oftentimes you'll see magazines on sale, but I rarely, if ever, see certain magazine springs on sale. And if the magazine has a certain amount of wear on the body and the base plate, I would just toss the magazine and buy a complete new unit. Of course, if you have friends like I do who are scroungers, they may have a heart attack if they see you doing that. My buddy saw me tossing some otherwise decent magazines into the scrap heap, and he nearly fainted. But then again, he's a guy who goes to the dump with 10 items and comes back with 12. To me, spending a little extra money and resources on a defensive firearm is a wise investment rather than a waste. So that's about all I have on magazine maintenance schedules. I'll do a follow-up video on actual magazine cleaning, hopefully in the near future, if we can ever get our Superstorm Sandy craziness straightened out. So thanks for watching. This is the Suburban Sentinel. Shoot safely, everybody.